Okay, here we are at 10 o'clock. We've got some people joining us. Good morning. We may have a few more cycle in as we get started, but we've got a lot to cover, so I think it's fair to get going. So good morning and welcome everyone who's here tuning into today. We are going to be talking about bringing employees back to the office of the future. And this is the latest in GGFL's Beyond the Numbers series for business leaders. My name is Natalie Evans. I'm a partner and head of assurance at GGFL, and I have always been fascinated by businesses and really how people run them. And more often than not, that means the challenges that they face and how they face them and what they do. So today we're going to be looking at one of those great challenges of running a business currently, which is how do we bring people back to the office? Number one, safely, legally, and ultimately successfully. So when it comes to how to do this, we're all in uncharted waters. I think that's fair to say. So we've brought a panel together. We've got our three experts with us here this morning who all bring a different perspective on the topic. We're going to be talking about legal issues, and we have Sheri Farahani, an employment lawyer and partner at IMA Hardin LLP. Good morning, Sheri.
Morning.
We are going to be talking about employee engagement and leadership, and we have Margo Hoyt with us. Margo's a managing director and senior vice president of LHH's Talent and Leadership Development Practice. Good morning, Margo.
Good morning.
And to talk about the office environment, we have Mandy Sutherland, and Mandy is a senior consultant with Steelcase Applied Research and Consulting. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
I'm going to start us off with some of the legal issues that companies need to address. But Sheri, I just want to say welcome again. And before diving in with the questions and putting you on the hot seat, I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your firm and practice.
For sure, thanks. As you mentioned, I'm a partner with the law firm of IMA Hardin LLP. And for anyone who's not familiar with us, we're still referenced as what you call a boutique style law firm, where we restrict our practice to one area of law, which is representing all types of employers, businesses, business owners with respect to any matters related to their employees. So this includes human rights, labor law, employment law, occupational health and safety, workers' compensation. There's a ton of stuff to do, and we're well over 40 lawyers now. So we're one of Eastern Ontario's largest law firms dedicated to representing employers' interests, and actually one of the largest management side labor and employment law firms in Canada. So while we're called a boutique, I think we might be outgrowing that title a little bit, but it has more to do with the fact that we restrict our practice to one area of law.
That's fair. And I have no doubt that over the last 20 months, there's been no shortage of work and that you guys are very busy. And I'm really curious about what are some of the most common questions that you're handling right now about offices being reopened?
For sure. As you said, no shortage of work at the moment, extremely busy because as you mentioned on the front end of this, everyone is dealing with new every day. Every day there's something new, every day there's something different. And at the moment, there is a lot of obligations on employers placed upon them, both under labor relations obligations, as well as with respect to keeping not just their own employees, but also patrons of their services safe. So there's a lot of questions about how to navigate all of this, and we're happy to help with that. And the main questions we get are exactly those items that we're going to be covering in this particular presentation. The number one questions that we're receiving right now are, we're currently still having a lot of employees doing remote work or maybe still on layoff or not return to work. And what do we do about that? How do we return to a more, and I'll do the quotes, a normal situation or back into the office? And in context with that, what are my health and safety obligations as an employer to these employees? Can I require employees to return to the office or working in person? And should I have a COVID-19 vaccination policy? And if so, should it be mandatory or voluntary? So exactly this topic that we're covering today is really the most hot topical items that our clients are bringing to us at the moment.
Everyone online is saying, yes, yes, tell me more. And I promise that we'll get there. We've got a lot of great content to cover. And just before we get there, Mandy, I'm just going to turn it over to you to say hello. And so tell me more. What does a senior consultant at Applied Research and Consulting with Steelcase do?
Well, many of you probably know Steelcase as a furniture company, and we've been around since about 1912. But you may not know that we have a very significant research arm within our organization. We do a lot of global research, diving deeply into kind of the changing trends and nature of work, workers, and workplace. Because ultimately, as a company, what we're trying to do is to help organizations create the best possible work experience for their people, regardless of where they're working. So my team is responsible for using that research, for applying that research in our consulting practice to actually help clients develop workplace strategies that are very specific to their needs and their organizations, help them prepare their people for new ways of working, and ultimately help them measure success to know if what they're doing is the right thing to do. So this whole pandemic has created a huge opportunity for my team to help clients figure out what is this next iteration of the workplace and how do we leverage space to help drive the kind of culture that they need as they come back to the office.
Thank you, Mandy. I know we're going to hear more about that and how staff have changed about the home office and how we bring that into the office as we move along. And Margo, thanks for joining us today as well. So tell us a little bit about LHH and your work as a managing director.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you for having me join you today. This is a great panel. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, Natalie. LHH is a global human capital organization, and so we operate in 60 countries and with about 12,000 clients every year. In Canada, though, you might know us better as LHH or LHH Knightsbridge. Some have worked with us as part of our executive search, interim, or retained placement. That's on the bringing great talent into an organization. Some have worked with us on a career transition side, and that's really about how we help individuals who need to leave an organization find their next career stop. Very proud of those two parts of our practice. The work that I oversee for Canada is around talent and leadership development, which for us includes supporting leaders to execute strategy, to manage through crises like we're doing right now, and to move organizations forward. So think about coaching, think about assessment to identify talent and succession management. Think about leadership development programs and really making sure that we can lift up leaders to be the best that they can be for our organizations and for the individuals within them. So that's the kind of work that we do, and we're across the country.
That's great. I think you're gonna help us understand how we do all of these things and bring people back to the office successfully, and I appreciate that. And before we even get to the how, I want to talk about why. So, why is it time to bring people back potentially? And Margo, I'm going to stick with you. This question is for you. So what have companies been missing out on or struggling with since we all had to pivot and start working from home, right? So like, why do we even need an office?
Well, it's interesting because we also have done some research, and we know that about 62% of individuals actually want to work from home, right? At least 40% of the time. So it's not a slam dunk that people are just clamoring to get back to the office. I think we know that. But what we see and what we hear from our clients that they're missing is really related to culture and to the connection with people and understanding their mental health and well-being, right? So from a culture perspective, that's, the unwritten or the written laws about how we want to behave, how we want to make decisions as part of an organization. And when we're not together more often, there's a real concern that that culture is getting diluted or lost or shifting unintentionally to something that's not what is needed to propel the organization forward. And I think that's a real concern, and we do need to work differently and work harder to maintain and sustain a healthy culture. On the mental health and well-being side, I think there's a genuine concern about society and our mental health, having been going through this now for about 20 months. And again, we know that, like from our research, that about 32% of Canadians are saying their mental health has suffered over the past 12 months. More often with the sort of Generation Z and baby boomers and other demographics, but it's something that we should all be paying attention to. And Natalie, if you and I were working together, you can turn your camera off, and I don't necessarily know that you're holding your hand, or that you're holding your head in your hands, or that it's been a really tough day. And this is the 5th day in a row where it's been a really tough day. So it's harder to see those cues and to really understand how real is the burnout, how difficult is it for the lives of our employees, not just professionally, but personally. And I think those are things that we really look forward to being able to gather and to connect and more face-to-face opportunities.
I think, if I can pull the thread on just to tie all of that together, it sounds like risk management. I mean, there's a lot of different pieces, but it sounds like there's a lot of things at risk there. And you mentioned, the statistic about people really wanting potentially this hybrid model, work from home about 40% of the time. And so that's going to change the expectations of how we work together, right? So what are some of the new expectations?
Flexibility, 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 right? So there's flexibility about when we work. We've been dealing with that certainly over the last 20 months, and creating some boundaries and having some respect for each other about what that looks like. There's flexibility about when we work and where we work in terms of the office or at home, or I have a colleague today in the Barbados working from there around vacation, right? So there's all sorts of flexibility that way. And there's flexibility about how we show up, right? So pants are still required, but family interruptions, technology challenges, pets, we actually expect to have some of these things show up, right? So I think that flexibility and really paying attention to the whole person and what they need is really important. And that kind of links with the other piece that we really have seen, and that's been well discussed and documented over the last 20 months around this need for leaders to be authentic, to show that they care, to demonstrate their own vulnerability, to be paying attention to the whole person that they work with, not just the professional side, but because there's so much going on below the surface, if you will, or behind the virtual backgrounds, that's really important that we have the expectation of each other that we're paying attention to the whole system, the whole person.
I think it's a fair expectation. And with the flexibility, it sounds like, we're opening ourselves up to having to deal with and a lot more, but flexibility can also bring some opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
So how do we capitalize on some of those opportunities and ultimately bring our team closer together in a more effective, cohesive, collaborative way going forward? And Mandy, I'm going to pick up on the fact that Margo was mentioning about how employees want potentially this hybrid and home office work week. And that's not new. I think it's been all over the news and there's been lots of studies around it. But if the office is not really the place that we go to every day, how do we make sure that our office serves its purpose? The purpose of it may change. What does it look like?
Well, if a lot of people are saying they like the hybrid work because working from home allows them to really focus effectively, concentrate, and kind of get on top of more of that production type work. So if home continues to be that option, then the office, it becomes more of a destination to connect people, to strengthen networks, to create that sense of belonging. It's interesting, belonging and community are two things that Margo was talking about. And it's interesting, in our research, we showed that when there was a high sense of belonging and community, that it was linked to higher business outcomes around innovation, attraction, retention, productivity, and engagement. People actually, feeling connected to that organization. So the office needs to be designed to really encourage those connections. Learning is another big piece, not training. Training is very episodic and it's very formalized, but people learn a lot by overhearing other conversations, by overseeing work in progress. So the office is an opportunity for that kind of learning. And I'm especially hearing that from younger people who are coming out of school highly educated. They know how to do things, but they don't know how to do it the way that particular organization does it. So they're feeling a little bit lost and not quite sure if they're doing a good enough job. Also, a big one is collaboration. So while some forms of collaboration are quite effective virtually, i.e. sharing information, like what we're doing here, there's other types of collaboration that are best done face-to-face in the office. So the type of kind of what we call generative collaboration or creative collaboration, where people are layering ideas on top of each other, it's very hard to do via technology. The technology just isn't as effective. And there's something about the energy in the room. I think, sports teams find this all the time, that when the crowd is there cheering them on, they actually play better. And so there's something around that energy in the office, serendipitous encounters where people bump into each other and it's like, oh, you reminded me of something, or, ooh, do you know the answer to this? So the office is all about those connections. Now, that's not to say you still can't support focus in the office, because people don't collaborate 8 to 10 hours a day. There's a cycle of knowledge creation. So
if I can tune in to everybody who's at home, or in their office listening to us today, I think they're going, you're talking to me. I identify with so much of everything that you're saying already this morning. And some of the challenges that we, or that we're having to face, or that we worry about or have to answer to is potentially, maybe some people don't want to come back to the office. Maybe they are quite comfortable at home and feel that they're quite productive. And And we've talked about why it's important to come together in the office. So Margo, what are, if people are identifying with that, what are they really concerned about when, hey, it's time to come back to the office is coming up?
Yeah, and picking up what Mandy said, the research that we've done show that 33% of Canadians feel they're actually more productive working at home. And it's potentially those introverts, it's potentially those who have really focused work and don't like the distractions or the hubbub of an office environment. What we hear, though, that they're primarily concerned about, and 42% of folks are still saying that they have anxiety about returning to the office, right? They're excited to see colleagues, more than half are well excited to see them, but they have anxiety. It's about the safety of the space and the commute. So there is something that's really important about that, and that's table stakes, right? We know that it's got to be visible. It can't just be enough to tell people that their offices are clean. They need to see it. They need to understand that it's really there, right? So that safety perspective is really important. And then work-life balance. I think we've all appreciated a chance to redefine what work-life balance looks like and find new and creative ways of capturing the space that we might have been spending commuting or parking, right? That we can actually use differently. We can use some of it for professional, we can use some more of it for our personal lives. And so protecting that work-life balance and not falling back, reverting into old habits of, oh, well, I'll just go in for that early morning meeting a few times a week, or I'll stay late for a few evening meetings, right? That we want to be able to maintain that work-life balance. And there's something about going back to the office, I think, that talks about reverting potentially to some old work-life balance bad habits.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the office we left is not the office we're going back to, right? And we each have our piece in making sure that we maximize what that means. But there are lots of positive aspects that we've heard about, from working from home. So when coming back to the office, Mandy, what should companies do to bring any of those positive aspects into the office that we find from home?
For sure. Well, over the course of the pandemic, we did multiple research projects on a global basis. I think we touched like 52,000 people in 11 different countries. And it was interesting. There were patterns on a global basis and how the work from home experience has really shaped people's expectations for coming back. And so we know, Margo mentioned this, we know that working from home, people really have been able to focus in a way that they have never been able to do in the office, which over the last 5 to 10 years has gotten worse because we've been cramming more and more people in, densifying offices. And I think it's become really, really amplified this need for focus. So being able to provide better places to focus in the office, thinking about the accessibility, thinking about acoustical and visual privacy, giving people choices of places based on the level of privacy they need. Think about at home. You can open a window, you can turn on or turn off a light, you can change your posture, you can go sit on the couch to do a call, that type of thing. So people are really wanting that ability to choose the best place to work, based on the posture, the lighting level, the degree of access. So having more control. And pre-pandemic, our research showed that in the office, only about 38% of people actually had any kind of control over their environment in the office. So now that they've been at home for a couple of years, it's become an even bigger issue. And just that whole ability. Oh, and the permission, that's another big thing. At home, I felt like I could work anywhere. In the office, it'll be really critical for leaders to both explicitly and implicitly demonstrate that people have permission to be able to leverage potentially the broad range of spaces that hopefully organizations will introduce. So people have that.
I'm hearing more about flexibility, right? This concept of flexibility continues to come up, and I have no doubt that it'll be a theme throughout the rest of our discussion. So flexibility and trust. So I'm going to move on into how do we actually now call people back to the office and get ready to call people back to the office. And Sheri, I'm putting you on the hot seat now around the legal issues. And so we've seen plenty of examples, and it's been all over the media. We've seen it in practice now. Companies, governments, hospitals, schools requiring staff to be vaccinated before they return to the office. So if a company wants to do it themselves, private business, are there steps that should be followed to make it a proper company policy?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I mean, this is probably the main headline that everybody has seen over the last couple of months, talking about COVID-19 vaccination policies. And often the one that you'll see in the news is a discussion of a mandatory vaccination policy. Just like everything, usually some stuff that makes good sound bites for news purposes aren't really clear to people as to what they should be doing. But the one thing I think is interesting is certainly in my experience, I'm noticing that a lot of clients, a lot of employers that are calling me, the reason why they're calling is actually arising out of some of the things that we just spoke about, that Mandy and Margo were talking about, which is employee reluctance to return until the employer can provide some sort of assurances around what their vaccination policy is going to be. And it actually has more to do with employees saying, well, I'm vaccinated and I want to know, and I'm happy to return and I'd like to return, but I need to understand, are other people also going to be vaccinated, and the people that I'm working with. So it's an interesting tool, I guess, in the toolkit of employers. We know that certainly Ottawa Public Health has recommended having a vaccination policy. If you Google Ottawa Public Health and vaccination policy, you'll find actually they've posted a guideline and helpful information to get started on that. But I mean, what I thought we could cover kind of in speaking about the vaccination policy is what is it? Well, a mandatory vaccination policy is something that says we as an employer would like to, for the purpose of ensuring health and safety in our workplace, which employers are obligated to do, whether it be Ontario, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or in the federal sphere under the Canada Labour Code, there are legal obligations on employers to provide safe and healthy workplaces for their employees and workers. And so as part of that, and given obviously what our federal government stance has taken on it, we've also got a provincial government stance, and then locally with the Ottawa Public Health Unit, certainly a COVID-19 vaccination policy is an option that everybody should be considering. But under that, there's all sorts of choices to be made. Do you have a unionized workplace? Do you not? Because if you do, then at a certain point, obviously, you're also going to want to involve the bargaining agent that is working on behalf of the employees. And if it's not, you're going to want to know what other policies do we have? What kind of employment contracts do we have? What other elements do we need to take into account as employer? But the most important thing, or the reason that's going to cause you to decide what kind of vaccination policy do we want? Do we want it to be voluntary? Do we want it kind of to be a hybrid, a strongly encouraged vaccination or mandatory? Is really going to be driven by what kind of employer are you? What kind of work do you do? So obviously, for example, both with respect to legal obligations and how to try to promote health and safety in a workplace, a long-term care home, for example, is going to want to have a different type of COVID-19 vaccination policy than you might find in a software development firm. For very good reasons, which are, first of all, there's legal implications as to what are the rules that need to be followed for a particular type of industry, but also how do my employees do their work? Do my employees touch other people all day? Do my employees sit, on a couch, as you mentioned, in the living room and draft code, maybe, right? So it's really going to be driven by the employer. And it's also going to be driven by what the employer wants to do with respect to return to work. So it's a really nice thing to consider. It's a tool, I would say, as part of a toolkit. You're going to want to figure out what are your legal obligations with respect to having a vaccination policy. Are there particular, because there are in healthcare, certain rules that I should follow, also construction, or, can I do what I want here, and what is recommended, and what kind of vaccination policy should I have? And like any policy, if it's a unionized workplace, we need to make sure that, again, you're looking at the collective agreement and ensuring that you're implementing it properly as it relates to labor relations obligations in the collective agreement. If it's a non-union workplace, you're going to want to make sure that you also make all workplaces are required to have safety plans, as well as Occupational Health and Safety Act policies. And so now is the time to look at all of that in the context of a return to work policy or plan. The vaccine policy is just a tool in that plan. It is not the be all to end all. And that's the message I want to give. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And it sounds like there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of pieces that are integrated with one another. So they're going to, you touch on one and you're going to peel back and touch on a few other things. I have more questions for you, Sheri. And before I move on, I just wanted to let people know that we hope to have a point at the end where we can answer some questions. So there's a Q&A at the bottom of your screens. And if you'd like to post some questions, then we'll try to get to that at the end and answer them if we can. So Sheri, we talked about the vaccination policy, which I know is top of people's minds. Is there any other, legal either requirements or recommendations that you would make for people to consider outside of the vaccination policy piece?
For sure. And that's the one thing I want to emphasize in this is because vaccination policies are getting such media attention, employers can think, well, if I just have that, whatever that is, once I figure out what that is, then I'm good and I've met my requirements. But again, in reality, it's a tool that's got to come in under a broader plan, which is the return to work plan more generally. And a return to work plan more generally should include not only how do we keep people healthy and safe in the workplace, of which a vaccine policy may be part of that, but it's also going to include who are we bringing back and why? Who do we need back in the office and why? And as part of that, then we also have to be familiar with, do we have unionized employees or not? And if we have unionized employees, there's other legal implications like, what does the collective agreement say about the order in which I have to recall employees to the workplace? Mm-hmm. And there's certain procedures and protocols that have to be followed. So just a reminder that, covering off the vaccination piece is actually just a small part of many other legal things that we should be thinking about at the time of returning people to work. Are the people currently on infectious disease emergency leave because they're non-union and there isn't enough work for them yet, and the employer now wants to recall them from that? Are they on temporary layoff under a collective agreement or even an extended period of recall rights? Who are my employees and what type of employees are they? And what type of further legal implications should be considered by us as a group, as an organization, to ensure that the vaccination piece is covered, yes, but also all of our other potential legal obligations with respect to either moving employees from infectious disease emergency leave or temporary layoff back to work, or moving employees who have always been at work but working remotely back into the workplace.
Sounds like don't do it quickly, but do it carefully and thoughtfully. And it sounds like there's a bit of a sequential order to it, right? So if you're following all the steps and giving it due care and consideration, you'll lead your path better to success.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tie it that way because it sounds very complicated. And I'm so pleased that you guys are with us to help us through this complicated, complex process. And it's a process that continues to change. And Sheri, I've got a very pointed question for you because if it's not in the Q&A now, I guarantee that it would be by the end. So I think that, some people have heard, as a business, can somebody say, I'm working at home really successfully. I am as productive as I've ever been. I'm not coming back to the office. I refuse. I'm going to stay working from home. It's where I do my best work. So how do they deal with that? And is that a valid statement? Right.
And I think the way to answer it is the way that drives all clients crazy when lawyers answer it this way. And I'm also going to say accountants, which is in the short answer, no, but in the long answer, it depends. And I know it drives everybody crazy. So I'm just taking that head on. The short answer is an employer is entitled to determine what kind of business it wants to be in and how it's going to carry out that business. Mm-hmm. That is still the employer's right to do. And of course, though, as they do that, they have to respect all the various laws and obligations and rights and privileges of everybody in the workplace. So of course, that's the trickier part to unpack. If an employer decides that the work needs to be performed in the workplace and that has to be sooner rather than later, again, I remind you that I certainly have dealt with lots of folks in industries where employees have never worked from home during the entire pandemic. We can think of grocery stores, we can think of healthcare facilities, we can think of lots of employers who, from the day this hit, every single day, had to figure out how to have employees who are interacting very closely with patrons or people in their care how to keep them safe, how to keep patrons safe, how to follow all the rules that are constantly changing. And so yet there are other employers who really haven't, dipped their toe in the water yet on that front, and they're just coming to that now. So in addition to sort of everything you have to think about, we know that employers, based on the type of business they do, are in different stages of that scenario. But it all comes down to the same approach, I think, which is, if someone's refusing to come to work in any manner, my first suggestion is to communicate about why. Why is that? So again, it's cute to say, well, no, if you need to come to work, you come to work. Like, that's the employer's ability to determine where that's going to be. But for employees, I think I go back to what Margo and Mandy were talking about, which is, it's almost part of the process to assume that when you put together your return to work policy, or protocol, when you're an employer who's maybe had employees not working throughout the pandemic or working but from home, just like they said, it's actually kind of normal right now to anticipate that there is going to be reluctance, at least at the low level reluctance, and at the highest level, maybe outright refusal. And the best way to kind of approach it on the front end first is to figure out that question, why? Why is this? Not beyond, obviously, well, because this is what we're doing, this is what we're going through as a humanity at the moment, but the more individualized approach to why. And this is why I said it's that whole, it depends. If you scratch the surface, often there's other factors in the request, like maybe someone's having childcare issues that they haven't actually gotten around to sort out yet, because they didn't realize that the employer's return to work plan was coming upon them so quickly. Maybe there is a health concern, a disability. Maybe there is a fear that, because they're not familiar with the employer's COVID-19 vaccination policy, that while they're vaccinated, their coworkers will not be, and they're just afraid. So there's lots of sort of underlying reasons of why would someone maybe refuse. And so definitely we want to have people engaged with asking those questions. And I think that an approach that's helpful, and it's what I'm going to say sort of at the end as well on trying to give people steps to work with. If you approach a return to work, if you're an employer who has had a lot of your employees working remotely, and you approach it as, I need to have a return to work plan. I need to have a COVID-19 safety plan that specifically covers off health and safety. And as part of that, I also need a vaccination policy of some kind. That's a good kind of place to start to ground all of these questions. And once you have that worked out, and we can go through the more detailed steps on all of that a little bit later in the hour, but once you have that ready, then you're also going to be ready to communicate, right? And many of the questions that people may have are likely already covered in those items. And so where you might get the higher amount of pushback on the front end, if you haven't worked through these things yet and you're trying to bring people quickly, by going about this, if you have the privilege as an employer to have a bit of time, because there are multiple employers who do not have the privilege to just wait several months to put this all in place, it's helpful because the communication is already going to answer a lot of the questions. But when it comes down to it, simply, I'm comfortable at home, I'm productive at home. And although I used to always work in the workplace 5 days a week, and my work is something that is required to be done in the workplace, but I don't want to, and I don't really have any other reason, that's not at the end of the day gonna be a sustainable position, let's say, for that person. But in what to do with that, obviously in conjunction with your legal counsel, you're going to want to review what are the actual reasons that the person gave to you when discussing where this position is coming from, and what have we communicated to this person to try to deal with those concerns. And then, of course, with legal counsel, determine, are any of those reasons something that might trigger an employer's obligation to accommodate under the under the Human Rights Code. For example, sometimes there may be things we hear about disability or family status, or is there something that you're hearing that may not permit the employee to stay home and work, but possibly permit the employee to trigger out a leave of absence under the Employment Standards Act or under a collective agreement? Such as infectious disease emergency leave is still available for employees who maybe have are dealing with certain issues, childcare, certain other things that in the short term, that may be something that would be available to them that they need. So fleshing out those details is also going to help you figure out what level of risk am I dealing with here as an employer? What are my obligations in law to accommodate some of these things before we move forward to maybe more firmly encourage people to, hit a particular deadline to get back to work.
Yeah, I think you hit on it though. It's the 5 whys, right? I think it's an opportunity to learn and dig just a little bit deeper and learn something. And then you know what you're working with at that point. So the 5 whys. And I'm going to turn our attention to the changing office environment. I know we touched on it a little bit before, but Sheri, while I still have you in the hot seat, and without taking a deep dive, just what are the top level health and safety requirements?
For sure, it's a great question. And because lawyers are so good at being brief, I'm as we know.
Well, we can peel back later, or actually I encourage people to reach out and talk to you to peel it back if they have some specific questions. So
yeah, but the way that I approach this is, for an employer who's attempting to figure out what are my health and safety obligations. Like I said, there are many employers who, particularly in hospitality industry, in food services, in grocery stores, have had to figure this out a long time ago, right? And yet, even though they figure it out, they have to constantly be aware that the ministry is often handing out further guidelines for various industries. So construction industry, education, healthcare, food service. There's lots more information now than there was that's readily available than there was at the front end of the pandemic, for sure. One resource that I like to point to people to, because in order to try to be brief, what I need to explain is any individual employer's occupational health and safety obligations in the workplace are driven by the legislation that applies to them, again, either in Ontario or under the Canada Labour Code, but it's also driven by what kind of work are you doing. A construction site is going to have very different obligations with respect to health and safety than a fast food restaurant. So but folks who are working in those places already know that, and really, so this is an add-on to what are the COVID-19 related sort of health and safety obligations that might be new or different, other than just sort of the usual industry specific health and safety that we need to look at. And so the top points I can give you on this is, every employer should ensure it has what's called a COVID-19 safety plan, or the Ministry of Labor would call it a workplace safety plan. And it covers various things, but in sort of going into the weeds or the details on that, a good general resource that I find, at least for Ontario employers, are on the Ontario Ministry of Labor website. You can find it by saying, typing in Ontario Ministry of Labor COVID-19 workplace safety plan, and the link will probably come up, but otherwise I can just tell you it's ontario.ca /page/COVID-19 workplace health safety. And those are all separated by hyphens. If anybody didn't get that, I'm happy to provide anything behind, but it's an Ontario Ministry of Labor site, and they've organized it so that it can help for folks who haven't developed a workplace safety plan yet. They should do so right away, and there's helpful resources for that. And there's also good general resources for what are the current main general obligations on workplaces, like continuing to use masks, screening for COVID-19, taking steps that you should implement if employees eat in the workplace, like in a break room or a staff room. It also talks a little bit about COVID-19 vaccines, and then general workplace health and safety. But it also goes further and has these really helpful links, or guidance notes, they're calling them, for individual sectors, such as, the main ones are education, construction, restaurant, food services, and childcare. So lots of good resources there, depending on at least a very good starting spot, so that you can figure out, what do I know, what do I not know, what do I need help with? And of course, our firm's website, the IMA Hardin LLP website, also has what we call a COVID-19 hub, where we have any newsletters or articles or updates related to breaking, news items or extended things that our clients should be aware of, both with respect to provincially regulated employers and federal.
Thanks, Sheri. I'm going to ask a question of Mandy, but if you have a moment and you wouldn't mind popping those into the chat, maybe people could take them down and copy and paste and save them for later, maybe your firm website and also the ontario.ca piece. Those are great resources. Mandy, office environment, health and safety. So I think every employer, I mean, certainly GGFL, whenever we are working on any of our own planning and bringing everyone back to the office, safety has always been our top consideration and concern. And so what, from a physical environment perspective, what can people do to protect their staff when they bring them back to the office?
Right. Well, I'm going to give you kind of some short-term, what people are doing now and what we're recommending now, and then what we're looking at from a future perspective. So there's three key things: density, being able to manage that density and being able to measure it too, so that are you at the safest level? Density, we're also seeing in meeting rooms. 6-person meeting rooms basically can only really hold 3 people. So that's one thing. Considering the layout or the geometry of the space, are people facing away from each other or facing into each other? And can they move seats farther apart in some of these more collaborative settings, lounge settings, that type of thing? So there's density, there's geometry, and then the third one is division. The level of division at the desk level, is it high enough that people can take off their masks when they're sitting at their desk? Is there enough division that the transmission won't happen? Because one of the biggest inhibitors for people to come back to the office is they don't want to wear masks the whole time, and having places that are kind of safe zones that you can take off masks. Cleanliness, no big surprise there. A lot of organizations are really doubling down on things like clean in, clean out policies, but it's important to have those products available, having these, what we would call sanitation stations nearby. And then the biggest one is perhaps the behavior change. You can do all the right things, but if people aren't following protocols and if they're not being reinforced, then it kind of falls apart. Now, what we're also doing, because we suspect this is not going to be the last, virus that hits us, is we've been working with MIT to really develop new solutions that are going to help to mitigate the transmission of pathogens. So looking at surface materials, looking at design, all of these things from a scientific perspective to prepare for the future. But in the meantime, just even those things that I mentioned, the density, the geometry, the division, are going to help tremendously in the office.
So a lot around of our physical workspace and I mean, we touched on that earlier. People want to know, but they also want to see it. Not only do they want to see it, they want to see it in practice, right? And all the safety protocols being followed in the physical workspace. But I have a feeling, Margo, that it's going to take more than just adapting the physical workspace. And so if I can move beyond the physical workspace, what can some of our business leaders do to help ensure the successful return of staff to the new safe environment? So I'm assuming that the environment is now been rendered safe. What kind of skills do our business leaders need?
Well, there's no doubt that the purpose is essential and the safety is essential. And building on those pieces, it's really a change management initiative, right? So we're going to go back to those change management skills that we've been honing as leaders for our careers, aligning the senior leadership, engaging staff, communicating regularly, frequently, consistently, right? Really, really listening. And that leads to my point around connection, right? We talked about that before. And again, some additional research we've done lately shows that there's a chasm between how senior leaders feel they've been doing through the pandemic around connecting with their staff and how staff feel they've been connected with, right? So not a little bit of a difference, but 30 or 40 point differences depending on what part of the globe we're in, talking about, they have a strong relationship. Senior leaders saying, yes, I've got strong relationships. Their direct reports and non-managers saying, no, it's just not there, right? 30 or 40 point differences that they've met or exceeded expectations on building culture, right? So these are things that they really need to double down on. And so what does that mean in terms of skills and development? Emotional quotient, coaching skills, listening skills, communication and change leadership. Building teams, doesn't matter if they're always going to be in the office or in a hybrid format. There are ways you can do that effectively. Really purposely building opportunities to communicate. One-on-one, small teams, full organization. Go back to one-on-one, small teams, full organization, right? You have to build those. They're not going to happen accidentally, so we need to be intentional about it. Even things like having career management or career development conversations may have been more happenstance. They have to be intentional. They have to be scheduled. Your networking around who may help you with your career has to be scheduled and intentional, right? So these are things that we really need leaders to lean into. How can they be stronger at creating those connections? How can they show to be more authentic and vulnerable? And how can they draw people in so they feel that engagement that Mandy talked about? They feel that connectedness. They understand that their requirements for flexibility are being heard and are being addressed, right? That's what leaders really need to be paying attention to if they're going to have this kind of strong culture that they want to go forward with employees in wherever they are, right?
It sounds like being open, right?
Mm-hmm.
So really being open and asking for feedback, because it's not enough to assume that you're doing well because you feel good, but getting feedback and getting that check-in and the validation that we've got it right, or we've got some of it right, and maybe we've got this not quite right yet, and there's room for us to improve. So listen.
Yeah, that humility is critical, right? We came from a tell culture where I'm going to tell you how things are going to be done, and that's how I show strong leadership. Now it's like, I don't have all the answers. I can ask the right questions though, and I can engage the right people, and we'll build it together, right? That's the kind of leadership that has become more important in this era.
And it's, I think that there's really no shortage of challenges that people are feeling, and the idea of this 20 months now and ongoing has provided some challenges, but it also provides, I think, a lot of opportunities and areas of growth and a new sense of connectedness. And I think everyone wants to get it right. So, but there's going to be some consequences if we don't get it quite right and we don't put the hard work and the effort in. So maybe you can touch on some of what are the consequences, and then really, like, what's the benefit of getting it right? Why is the hard work and the listening and the openness and the humility and the vulnerability so important?
Yeah, the answer to both is really around talent, right? Our organizations are nothing without talent. We are experiencing a bit of a talent war right now, right? There is a demand for talented people. When you get it wrong, you're going to lose that talent. More than 70% of people are saying that flexibility is important for them, and 40% are willing to move if they can't get it. Right? So if we don't get it right, if we don't create that supportive culture where people feel safe, and I would say not only physically, but also psychologically safe to bring their best selves to work, then you're not going to be able to retain your top talent. And it's just that, it's that difficult, and it's that simple. So this game is right now is really all about retaining the talent that is ever so important for your organization. Get it right, you got them.
Yeah, and if you don't, you don't, right? You're right. It really is that simple, and it's far easier said than done. And I appreciate that. And you've given us a lot of really strong guidance in terms of some practical things that, and areas that people should be looking at. So I hope that lands with everybody. Before we take if there's any questions, I would love to hear some final thoughts from each of you. So just sort of like 1 to 2 things that everyone who's listening today can take away about what they should be doing, like right now. So what do you need to do right now to set up 2022 for success? So Sheri, maybe I can start with you.
Sure. Okay. So I think, again, it's the best that I can say is, or to come up with, is how to tackle this. I think a lot of people, and again, those employers who and again, I want to congratulate tons of employers in the Ottawa area and beyond who have been struggling and wrestling with these issues for months and months and years, frankly, to continue to provide those ongoing essential services that have actually never been able to be promoted or done remotely. And they have had to deep dive into this for quite a while. And for those others who are also then struggling with and dealing with remote work issues and keeping their employees safe remotely and performing performing work remotely in a productive way, turning your mind to this, if you do have the time or privilege, as I would say, to have a little bit of time to spend on this, my suggested approach is kind of in 3 steps. So I think the first thing that you need to think about is, do we need to return to the office right now? And if so, when? And if so, how? And I think that those items may not be law-based. Usually in my experience, they're more sort of business-based, and how you want to perform work, and taking into account all those great things that Margo and Mandy have been talking about, which is the actual, what do you want to do? For those of you who are privileged enough to have a choice on that, as opposed to what do we have to do because we are in a particular kind of business and need to provide a particular type of service. So what do we want to do? How do we want to do it? Covering off all of these office design ideas and talent retention ideas. That is your first step, I think, is turning your mind to that. Then second is where now it's a good time to fold in legal counsel and get advice at that point, right? Which is, now that we know what we want to do and how we want to do it and what our office is kind of going to look like, what steps do we need to make sure that how we've arranged things are still in compliance with our obligations as an employer? So what are our obligations with respect to this office in the short term, the midterm, the long term? What are our obligations with respect to health and safety obligations that apply to our remote workers? Because there are some. There are many. And so if what your plan is that you're going to continue to leave people working remotely, if you haven't yet, you're going to want to make sure as part of your return to work plan that you handle not just what happens to people when they return to the office, but what happens to people who are going to continue to be permitted to work from home, if that's your particular situation. And what do we need to do to make sure that all of the various legal obligations are covered off: health and safety, privacy, confidentiality, working hours, work balance, all that kind of stuff that people are used to managing in an office space. If it's now going to be a longer term plan that people will be permitted to do that, you may now want to also make sure you have a fully flushed out idea of remote work. What does that look like and how do we do it to make sure we're doing it properly in law? And then I think my step 3 is recognize that once you get that in order, your return to work considerations, how do I want to do it? What are the legal implications? What kind of actual written policy should I have to cover off those legal obligations, whether it be the COVID-19 safety plan, as I talked about, a vaccination policy, and a return to work plan? I would say everybody should be considering some form of those 3 items to support your efforts, and then have them vetted by counsel and work through that. And once you have that, then it's time to communicate and expect or anticipate that there's going to be resistance to change, right? And recognize that hopefully getting out on the front end and communicating well with thoughtful policies that you are confident in, that they are compliant and fair and firm, frankly. If you've got to get to where you need to be as an organization, then management and folks can feel more confident in what you're rolling out because it's already been vetted for all of those things, right? And then when you get any sort of resistance or reluctance, hopefully it's much less because you've handled that communication piece off the front end. And then you drill into the individual circumstances of where is that reluctance coming from? And is there individual reasons that we need to be aware of as an employer to make sure that if there's an accommodation issue, we're getting the proper information and determining what it is and what do we need to do in that scenario. And if there's I qualify for some sort of leave issue, that we gather the proper information to determine whether this individual does qualify and they're obtaining, what they should in law. So 3 sort of steps on an approach to handling this.
I appreciate you breaking it down that way, because you can digest them that way. I know it can seem overwhelming, but there's some great resources and some and now great people resources just by virtue of having you today, and people can certainly reach out and talk to you specifically because it is so very individual. Mandy, do you have a couple of thoughts to leave us with?
For
what
sure.
Can we do now for 2022?
Okay, so If you think about it, no organization, except maybe a few organizations, have never actually executed hybrid work at this level before. Yes, they've tried it, you know, maybe they've been doing it in small level. So be prepared to experiment. There is no easy button. We don't have best practices yet. Nobody has all the answers. So be prepared to experiment. Our research has shown globally that 93% of companies surveyed plan to run some sort of workplace pilot or experiment that's going to really help to inform that strategy. And so that'll be really important. So don't just run a pilot for the sake of running a pilot. Run a pilot, have a very clear understanding or an idea of what you want to learn. Design your pilot, whether it's a technology pilot, change management, furniture, leadership practices, whatever. And run your pilot, measure it, learn from it, be prepared to pivot and iterate. That'll be the most important, because no two organizations are going to approach it exactly the same way. The second big thing is recognize that the work from home experience really has influenced what people's wants and needs are. So understanding that will help you to understand what you really need to reconsider in your own environment at the office if you want people to be productive and engaged. You can force them back, but if you don't provide them with the right tools and environment for them to be successful, you're not going to get the best out of your people.
I appreciate that. Again, it's a willingness to learn. And I like the idea that this is forever changing, it seems. And we always have the ability to listen, get feedback, and learn and pivot, right? So it's okay if we don't get it perfect the first time, but as long as we continue to listen and make some improvements, we're headed in the right direction. Margo,
Yeah.
one or two things, what can we do to really set ourselves up for success in 2022?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate things around the leadership really needs to pay attention to the people, right? So we've talked about this, about the well-being. We can't lean in on that enough. There's a real concern. And creating that connection, understanding that there is not a one size fits all. The four of us could talk offline about what's important to each of us. It will be different for each of us, right? And that just needs to be magnitude. So leaders really need to lean into that, and organizations need to support their leaders. These are not muscles that we've been developing for the last generations, right? Many leaders are struggling with, how do I make time? Is that really my job to make time for these kinds of conversations? How do I get that kind of information from my employees, right? We need to support those leaders with coaching and development to build those skills. It's not enough to just say, we expect you to be a different kind of a leader, without giving them the support to build and develop those new skills, to create those muscles so that they can show up better. And that's, that's where I think if we can focus on really making sure that leaders are there for their employees, but organizations are doing what they need to do to support their leaders.
And if I can leave anybody with anything, it's get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. It's okay. And the best business leaders are fine with just that. Continue to listen, continue to learn, and you'll set yourself and your team up for the best chance of success. So we've come almost to the end of our hour, and I just want to thank all of you for attending. Margo, Mandy, Sheri, thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning. It's been really valuable in terms of knowledge sharing and guidance. Sheri, thank you for posting those things in the chat. If people haven't picked those things up yet, please copy, paste them somewhere else so you have access to them later. There was a Q&A about sharing the presentation, and so it will be posted on the GGFL website. Feel free to go there to access it later. Thank you all again. I wish everyone well and a prosperous 2022, and dig in, get the hard work done. It's worth it. Thanks again.
Thanks, Natalie.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.